Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now, the next GRVA meeting is coming up in September and there is a new document that has been submitted as a working document for that meeting with some new information regarding the DCAS regulations. So I thought it would be a great idea to just go through it, to go through the changes of that specific document and see what is going to be discussed at that meeting. So as I mentioned, the next meeting will be from 23 to 27 September 2024, but that's just the meeting for the GRVA. The GRVA is the task force or the subgroup that is assigned with the task of defining the regulations for autonomous driving, amongst other things, of course, but this is the part that we are currently interested in. And once the document is approved, but there are a lot of changes here and a lot of options that are still in there, so I'm not quite sure if that's going to happen. But if it would be approved, then it could go to the WP29 meeting, which is from 12th to 15th of November 2024. Now that's only like 6 months, which is not a lot in regulatory terms. However, with the January meeting, the results were also at the end of January for the GRVA, and the WP29 meeting from March actually had the document proposed and accepted for the initial DCAS regulations without the most important part, the system-initiated maneuvers. So yeah, it could happen. I'm not getting my hopes too high, but we may get pleasantly surprised. And if they approve it at GRVA level end of September, then the WP29 should just be a formality. And then somewhere Q1, maybe Q2, depending on the time frame they want to give it, it might actually come into effect. And that would be good, of course, because we're all waiting on the possibility for the supervised FSD from Tesla to come our way to Europe and the other countries from the UNECE. I want to reiterate that again as well, that these regulations are UN regulations and not EU regulations. Too many people ask me questions about is Brexit affecting this? Yes or no? Yep, you're still in Europe, you're still bound by the UNECE. Countries that are outside of the EU, yes, they are bound by the UNECE. So these regulations also apply to countries such as Norway, such as Switzerland, such as South Africa and even Australia. But let's dive into a few of the general requirements that we have. So in general, the whole system needs to protect against over-reliance, misuse and modifications. So that means that Tesla and other brands need to build in several checks, several systems to avoid the over-reliance, to avoid the misuse, for example, with the steering wheel weights that are being used where Tesla already has a little bit of a system to detect it. And of course, modifications for the real hackers that will screw open the autopilot box and start soldering some modifications on there to read it and abuse it. Now, in the previous videos that I made about the DCAS, I also talked about the different types of maneuvers, and there was a little bit of confusion about the terminology in the comments, so I want to set the record straight here. There are actually 3 types of maneuvers. So we have the driver initiated maneuvers where the driver has full control and initiates everything. So that's the first one. We're not really interested in that one as well. The second one is driver confirmed maneuvers, where the system actually wants to initiate a maneuver but has to wait for a driver confirmation. Now the driver confirmation can be, for example, for a lane change, the driver looking in the side view mirror, or pressing a button, or doing something on the touchscreen, or touching the accelerator, something like that, which we already have, for example, for confirming that it can run through a green light. The part that we're mostly interested in is the system initiated maneuvers, where the system can actually initiate and execute the maneuver. But as I said, let's first look at the driver confirmed maneuvers. So to be able to execute such a driver confirmed maneuver, the driver has been detected to have directed their gaze to a driving task area relevant to the proposed maneuver for a sufficient period of time. So before it can execute the maneuver, it needs to assess that the driver is actually engaged and looking at things that have something to do with the driving task. Now, looking at the dashboard is specifically ruled out here. So it needs to be looking out the window, looking the side view mirror, looking the rear view mirror, those kinds of things. Looking at your screen or at your phone is definitely not going to be sufficient for a driver confirmed maneuver. Now, the system shall also visually inform the driver about the proposed maneuver. If informing about a series of maneuvers, it shall be a combination that is comprehensible to the driver. So if you go on a roundabout and take an exit, for example, as well, then it definitely will have to do both maneuvers or indicate both maneuvers. And then we come back to this part here for a sufficient period of time. And I'm not sure, there's no mentioning of any specific time length where it needs to be shown in advance for the system to actually allow the driver to confirm it and execute that specific maneuver. Also, the direction indicator shall not be used to inform the proposed maneuver. So we definitely need the screen. Just the indicators is not enough. We need information on the screen, the dash in front of us, or for the Model 3 and the Model Y in the center. And it needs to contain that information about what the car is actually going to do. Now, when we talk about the juicy part, the system initiated maneuver, is that the driver can or should be able to cancel the maneuver with sufficient time to do it. So in the past few updates, we've gotten an update that allowed you to cancel the navigation recalculation. I think it needs to be something like that, where it says, okay, the car is going to do this, and you have 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds to cancel that maneuver if you don't want the car to actually execute that. A system-initiated maneuver shall not be executed if in the past 7 seconds you have had an eyes on request. That means that you were not looking in the general direction of driving or at any driving task, not looking at the mirrors, but just looking at your phone, for example. This is going to be especially important when we're talking about the hands-off, eyes-on driving that we'll come back to later. So, and in addition, further strategies shall be implemented to ensure appropriate driver engagement prior to the initiation of the maneuver. So just detecting the eyes is not going to be enough. There needs to be more than that. So there might be an action, a sort of confirmation that you're engaged with the driving task and not really a confirmation of the maneuver itself. The system shall also not execute the maneuver if it's just an unreasonable maneuver. And you know that from previous videos, you need to have huge gaps to do a lane change, for example, so that will still remain more or less the same, while in dense traffic like urban areas, a lane change will actually be allowed with smaller distances, because let's face it, it's just not going to be possible within city limits to find a gap of over 30 meters to do a lane change, for example. So it also needs to adhere to the signage there. So if there's a one-way street, it cannot enter that one-way street if it wants to turn left, for example. If there's a right-of-way, it needs to be able to read those signs. I'm not sure how good it is already at that, specifically in the US with Supervised FSD 12.5, where everybody is so lyrical about, but I don't think that it's actually doing that. It's reading the road, it's reading hand signs already, which is quite impressive, but I'm not sure if it's reading all signs. And this is especially going to be a challenge in Europe, because each country has slightly different signs for the same situation. So there's going to be a lot of training data needed to actually be able to read all those different signs in all those different countries. And also it cannot cross lane markings which are not permitted. So a solid line is not going to be allowed to be crossed. Now you say, well, that seems like a logical thing, but in city limits, you can have solid lines. There's a car parked, double parked, for example. It's standing there illegally, but the car needs to be able to drive around it if we actually allow it to do that. Maybe the driver needs to take over in that specific situation. I don't know. The more common situation is going to be where you have a cyclist and you need to leave at least 1 meter of distance between yourself and the cyclist when passing. Now the roads in Europe are so narrow that you never have that room within the same lane. So as long as there's a wide solid line, we need to stay behind the cyclist at that point, or manually take over and then cross that white line if you really want to. But the system apparently will not be allowed to do that. Now when we're talking about speed limits, well, yeah, they need to comply to the speed limits. And that's going to, it's an obvious one, but it's going to be a challenge because still, even though the speed limit recognition has gotten better, there are a lot of cases where it doesn't work. So for example, if you have roadworks, we're in a 50 km/h zone, there's some roadworks, 30 km/h sign, the car is going to slow down to 30 km/h, end of roadwork sign, but not an end of 30 km/h sign, means that the car still thinks you can only do 30 km/h there. So signage is going to be really important, and interpretation of the signage as well. Irrespective of that, the system needs to adhere to the speed limits, and if it reads the wrong speed limits, then it's going to be an issue. So yeah, definitely more work for Tesla on that level. And I hope once we get the FSD or the supervised FSD or FSD beta, whatever they're going to call it here in Europe, in the first iteration, I'm really interested to see what that will do for us and whether or not it will improve. Now, what is also interesting is the fact that it needs to react to lane closures, lane reductions, toll stations, which I haven't seen in any video yet. If it exists, please link it below in the comments. I'm really curious to see what the car would do. How would it choose a toll station? How would it know that you have a badge that you can just drive straight through, or whether you would have to pay, for example? But on the other hand, if it says it needs to respond to toll stations, the response could just be to disengage the system and let the driver take over. So I don't see any issues in that. But if we want to go to level 4 in the future, this is definitely one that we will have to take into account as well. Now, of course, here the system needs to provide information ahead of the initiation of the relevant intended maneuver. So there needs to be sufficient time, just as with the driver confirmed maneuvers. The driver needs to be able to assess what the car is going to do, to prepare for what the car is going to do, and to check that what the car is going to do is actually going to be fine. Because remember, this is still a level 2 driver assist. It's a very advanced one, but it's not level 3, where you are not longer responsible for the car and the car is responsible for itself, or Tesla becomes responsible for the car. This is not such a system yet. So keep that in mind. You as a driver are always responsible for the behavior of the car, and you need to pay attention, and you will have to be able to take over at any point in time. Now, hands-on requests. So the HOR, hands-on request, is going to be given for after 5 seconds. If you have an eyes on, so if you're determined that you are engaged with your gaze, then it will be a maximum of 10 seconds. Right now we are at 15 seconds, so it's going to slow down or going to increase to basically 5 seconds. And if you're really paying attention, then it will be at 10 seconds. But there is no way of getting around it with a hands-on request, so simply nudging the steering wheel without becoming engaged in the system is not going to work anymore. Now for me, the hands-on detection needs to work really well to be able to get to these low numbers. Now, the way I drive nowadays is just one hand on the steering wheel and I just let it rest like that, and usually that's enough. I know that people actually use both hands on the steering wheel, and if you hold it with the same force downwards, so you're not turning the steering wheel because of the weight of one hand versus the other, then it's detecting there are no hands. So there's no point in squeezing, like I hear some or read some people mentioning. Squeezing doesn't help. It needs a torque for the Tesla system, and it does not recognize hands on the steering wheel just by a capacitive touch, for example. So that is definitely something to keep in mind as well. Now, what else? So yeah, just nudging it and not holding it is not going to work. So usually one hand, left or right, 8 o'clock if you have a round wheel, or one side of the yoke if you have a yoke. And then I never ever actually get the notifications if I do it that way. Usually when I enable autopilot and I have it with both hands and I just push the button for autopilot, then yeah, sometimes I do get a notification because I hold it with two hands and I just switch to one hand and there's no problem whatsoever. But the old days of letting go and getting into the lotus position with your hands near the bottom of the steering wheel but not touching the steering wheel, that is no longer going to work. Then we have the eyes on request, same thing, but also it's going to be for 5 seconds. So if you are not motorically engaged and you're not gazing in the right direction, then the eyes on request is going to trigger after 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds, make sure that you pay attention. So that means you need to pay continuous attention. And of course, if you just gaze back, you have an eyes on request. For example, this becomes important when we have the hands-off driving on highways, which is going to be allowed if this regulation is actually going to be approved. But if you just gaze back again for 1 second and then you gaze away to the screen, to your phone, whatever, after within a window of 2 seconds, it's immediately going to give you another warning. Now, we also, as I mentioned before, we also have within this regulation the hands-off driving on highways alone. So if you're on a highway and the system is capable of doing it, you will have the eyes-on, hands-off system available, like we have now in the US with 12.5, I believe it is, where you no longer need to hold the steering wheel. No, I'm already happy with that because most of the time autopilot is being used on the highways, and doing long drives, not having to have your hands on the steering wheel, but still remaining engaged with the system, remaining engaged with the driving task by keeping your focus on the driving itself. So looking through the window, looking at the side view mirrors to check traffic around you. That is definitely going to help to make it even more relaxed compared to what it is right now. Now, of course, then we come to the final part, and that's also a most important part, which is the punishments that they foresee within the regulations. So people are complaining about autopilot being taken away after 5 strikes or 3 strikes in some cases. Well, actually, Tesla and other brands are legally obliged to take actions when you are not engaged with the system. So for example, here the first option that they propose is that the system shall be designed to disable withholding of HORs, so no more hands-free driving for system-initiated maneuvers. If you have one unavailability response, so that is when the system has escalated completely and you don't react, basically a strike, right? So after 1 strike, it already cannot let you drive hands-off anymore. At most 3 direct control alerts, which means that you need to take over immediately for the car comes into a situation that it doesn't recognize and it doesn't know what to do. at most 5 escalations of eyes on or hands on requests, 10 eyes on or 10 hands on requests, and those within a rolling window of about 10 minutes. So in the past 10 minutes, you cannot have 5 alerts. So that's one every 2 minutes, basically, that you would get. And I kind of agree with this, because if you get that many alerts, you're not using the system the way it is, and you're thinking that it is a full self-driving car, which it isn't. Second option is a little bit different, that they, in the sense that they look at a 30-minute window, with a few of those in that 30-minute window and the others still within a 10-minute window. And also, important one, the last thing here, or the last sentence here, the rolling time window shall not be reset when the powertrain is reinitiated less than 5 minutes after it was switched off. Remember the days when we could actually go into park after it being disengaged, go into park, going to drive again, and you could use autopilot? Well, this part of the regulation says, nope, not gonna happen. You need at least 5 minutes between parking and restarting the car again. So yeah, those punishments are actually, they are necessary from a regulatory perspective. I can fully understand that they want to do something to keep the people engaged with the driving task, but on the other hand, I think there should also be like a bonus system where you can put in a joker if you're really always paying attention and you have just like one moment off. Well, on the one hand, I would say, okay, that could be forgiven. On the other hand, of course, that one moment off and not being engaged with the car, with the driving task, could actually kill somebody. So yeah, I understand the punishments that they are writing here. So yes, in conclusion, 23 to 27 September is the next one to look forward to. Usually about 2 weeks after that, we get the report published, and that's usually the point where I also will make a video to see what has been accepted, what not, and what can be expected, if it will go to the WP29 meeting in November, yes or no, and maybe, just maybe, early January, it's just a small change or an attachment to the already approved DCAS. If they consider it that way, January might be the first point where we could do that. But on the other hand, it could be June or March as well, as there is usually a period of about 6 months before the new regulations actually take effect. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and make sure you click that little bell icon so you don't miss out on any new videos. And for now, thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one. Bye bye.